As to what the goals were, of course, they're professed to be completely humanitarian, but it's worth remembering that when a state claims, not only a state, but its intellectual class and others, when they claim to be acting on humanitarian grounds, that statement, in the technical sense, carries zero information. And the reason is it's completely predictable. That happens all the time. I gave a couple of examples, Hitler, Mussolini, John Stuart Mill, you pick them. Just about every use of force is vested in noble humanitarian terms. If something's predictable, it just doesn't carry any information, so you disregard it. You dismiss it. Doesn't mean anything. So then you have to ask, was it really with humanitarian intent? Well, there you have to judge.
One good U.S. critic, Harold Rosenberg, once described intellectuals as the herd of independent minds. They think they're very independent, but they're stampede in a herd, which is true. When there's a party line, you have to adhere to it. And the party line is systematic. The party line is subordination to state power and to state violence. Now, you're allowed to criticize it, but on very narrow grounds. You can criticize it because it's not working, or it's a mistake, or benign intentions that went astray, or something. In fact, you see it right now in the Iraq War. There's a ton of debate about the Iraq War, but take a look at it. It's very similar to the debate in Pravda during the invasion of Afghanistan. Actually, I brought this up to a Polish reporter recently and asked him if he'd been reading Pravda. He just laughed. He said, yeah, it's the same. Now, you read Pravda in the 1980s, it's the travail of the Russian soldiers, too many are getting killed. There are these terrorists who prevent us from bringing justice and peace to the Afghans. We, of course, didn't invade. We intervened in order to try to help them at the request of the legitimate government. And the terrorists are preventing us from doing all the things we want to do. I've read Japanese counterinsurgency documents from the Second World War, from the 1930s. Same, we're trying to bring them an earthly paradise, but the Chinese bandits are preventing it. In fact, I don't know of an exception in history. You go back to British imperialism, it's the same.
Mr. Chomsky, we're talking there about American terror, and I think you make a very accurate observation that we are responsible for what we do, but hardly responsible for what other people do, except insofar as we are in a position to influence them. Right. For instance, if there is a mass starvation in Biafra, even though we did not cause it, there is a sense in which we are responsible if we don't do something to attempt to alleviate it. Yeah. Now, by the same token, if we are prepared to agree that it is not always easy to taxonomize military action into that which is terroristic and that which is purely a military operation, we are left with doubts, for instance, about the bombing of Germany in 1942, 43, 44. Mm-hmm. You might contend that this was terroristic and unnecessary, and you might be right, although you're not a military expert, neither am I. But I think there's a point to that. But I do judge that even if we all agree that what we did in Dresden was inexcusable, as a moral question, it's got to be understood in context of what was it that brought us to Dresden in the first instance. Absolutely. And what brought us to South Vietnam in the first instance, in my judgment, was clearly an uninterested, or I should say disinterested, concern for the stability and possibilities of a region of the world. What period do you feel that we had this disinterested relationship with Vietnam? Right now. No, at what period did we have it? Did it begin? Let's say 1951, for example, when the State Department bulletin points out that we must help the French reconquer their former colony, and we must eradicate all Vietnamese resistance down to its last roots in order to reestablish the French in power. Was that disinterested? To increase my vulnerability, I wish we had helped the French. We did. We supported them. Not sufficiently. Well, but there's no point in helping somebody insufficiently. It was hardly disinterested when we attempted, as
you know, with tremendous support, in fact, to reinstate French imperialism in South Vietnam.
Now, it was disinterested in this sense, and I think this is an important distinction for which you do touch on in your book. It's a disinterested act if my attempt to help, or your attempt to help a particular nation, is in order to spare you the possibility of a great ordeal in the future, which will harm you, your family, your children, your republic.
And in that sense, Nazi Germany was also disinterested.
Yeah,
after all, Nazi Germany was conquering Eastern Europe only in order to advance the values of Christian spiritual civilization and to restore the Slavs to their rightful home and so on and so forth. Totally disinterested.
Look, I follow you. But if you want me to pursue that digression, I will.
Okay.
But let's suspend it for a moment. Okay. I'm distinguishing that kind of disinterestedness between the kind of...
But that's not a kind of disinterestedness. You see, that's something which includes as a special case every case of military aggression and colonialism in history. It's all disinterested in your sense.
Well, all right, let me simply rest my case by saying that there is an observable distinction by intelligent men between a country that reaches out and interferes with the affairs of another country because it has reason to believe that a failure to do so will result in universal misery, and that country which reaches out and interferes with another country because it wants to establish Coca-Cola plants there and chase national banks and whatever and exploit it. Now, that is an observable
It's a conceptual well, let's distinguish between a conceptual distinction and a factual
I'm prepared
distinction.
to do that.
All right, it is a conceptual distinction, but in actual fact, the history of colonialism shows that these two motivations can coincide. That is, practically every, I mean, there are exceptions, you know, probably the Belgians and the Congo are an exception, but by and large, the major imperialist ventures have been in the economic, in the material interest or in the perceived material
I'm not
interest.
interested in the mathematics, but I'm interested.
Let me finish.
You have already conceded that it's not merely a conceptual difference.
I say it is.
There are exceptions.
There are a few exceptions.
All right.
Like say
Okay.
All
right, let's talk about the exceptions then.
Well, no, but the exceptions are at the difference. No, wait a minute. The exceptions I mentioned, for example, the Belgians and the Congo. There, they didn't even pretend to have a civilizing mission. There, it was pure material self-interest. These are the exceptions. There are, as far as I know, no exceptions on the other side. There are. I mean, maybe I've left out a case of history, but as I see the history of colonialism, the great massive cases are cases where a powerful country was working in its perceived material self-interest and was covering what it was doing to itself and to the world with very pleasant phrases about preserving Christian values or helping the poor benighted natives or one thing or another.
You say that what the media do is to ignore certain kinds of atrocities that are committed by us and our friends, and to play up enormously atrocities that are committed by them and our enemies. And you posit, in fact, you say in the Massey lectures that there's a test of integrity and moral honesty, which is to have a kind of equality of treatment of corpses.
Equality of principles.
I mean, that every dead person should be in principle equal to every other dead person.
That's not what I say at all.
Well, I'm glad that's not what you say, because that's not what you do.
Of course it's not what I do, nor would I say it. In fact, I say the opposite. What I say is that we should be responsible for our own actions primarily. The principle that I think we ought to follow is not the one that you stated. It's the principle that we rightly expect Soviet dissidents to follow. So what principle do we expect Sakharov to follow, let's say? What lets us decide whether Sakharov's a moral person? I think he is. Sakharov does not treat every corpse does not treat every atrocity as identical. He has nothing to say about American atrocities. And when he's asked, he says, I don't know anything about them, I don't care about them. What he talks about is Soviet atrocities, and that's right, because those are the ones that he's responsible for. Just as in, you know, it's a very simple ethical point. You're responsible for the predictable consequences of your actions. You're not responsible for the predictable consequences of somebody else's actions. Now, we understand this when we're talking about dissidents in the Soviet Union, okay? But we refuse to understand it when we're talking about ourselves for very good reasons. Commissars in the Soviet Union don't understand it about dissidents. Commissars in the Soviet Union attack Sakharov and other dissidents because they don't talk about American crimes, right? We understand exactly why that's just hypocrisy and cynicism when they do it, and we should understand the same when we do it. Now, the fact of the matter is that I spend a fair amount of effort on crimes of official enemies. There are a fair number of people in the United States and Canada from the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe who are there because of my personal activities on their behalf. But I don't take any pride in that particularly. I just do it because I'm interested in it. The most important thing for me and for you is to think about the consequences of your actions. What can you affect? Those are the ones you primarily ought to be concerned about. Of course, every corpse is a corpse, but there's some that you can affect and there are others you can't do much about. You know, like I can be worried about things that happened in the 18th century, but I can't do much about them.
You asked us after September 11, one of your points is we ought to look in the mirror, we being America or the West, we ought to look in the mirror at our own. Was that a way of saying, look, people like bin Laden are angry at us for good reason?
No,
in other words, is there a way to justify...
That's not what I was saying. The statement of mine that you just quoted is a very conservative statement. In fact, it was articulated by George Bush's favorite philosopher, Jesus Christ, who pointed out, famously defined the notion hypocrite. A hypocrite is a person who focuses on the other fellow's crimes and refuses to look at his own. That's the definition of hypocrite by George Bush's favorite philosopher. When I repeat that, I'm not taking a radical position. I'm taking a position which is just elementary morality.
But I don't want to get Gnostic here and religious on it, but I do want to...
This is not religion. This is elementary morality. If people cannot rise to the level of applying to ourselves the same standards we apply to others, they have no right to talk about right and wrong or good and evil.
But let's talk about even in right. And look, there's nobody pure, but an argument has been made. I know that the U.S. has committed atrocities. However, they did oust a more brutal regime, the Taliban. There was...
That wasn't even a war aim.
There
wasn't even a war aim. It wasn't even a war aim.
But is that a moral thing to do? They did get rid of a brutal regime. There was celebration in Canada. Now,
good, fine. Let them bomb Israel and get rid of the brutal regime there. Let them bomb Uzbekistan and get rid of the brutal regime there.
You say the Taliban and the Israeli government are the same?
No, they're not the same. They're brutal regimes. But let's go back a stage. The goal was not to oust the Taliban. That was not a war aim. That was a war aim that was picked up several weeks after the bombing started. Okay? And let's go back. Suppose that and there are dozens of, a long list of brutal regimes around the world which ought to be overthrown, but not by somebody bombing them. However, let's go back to the late October, when after 3 weeks of bombing, when the U.S. and its British client decided to shift the war aims to overthrowing the Taliban regime. There was a meeting sponsored by the United States in Peshawar, Pakistan, of 1,000 Afghan leaders. They unanimously condemned the bombing and said it was undermining their efforts, which they thought could succeed, to overthrow the Taliban regime from within. The U.S. is doing it just to show off their muscle.
All right, now
so the question of whether to overthrow a regime, yeah, that arises. And I think the Afghans are right. Regimes should be overthrown from within, and in this case it was probably very likely that that would succeed. It was a small, brutal group, highly unpopular, plenty of opposition to it, which could have been organized from within, and that's the way to overthrow a regime. If we want to overthrow the regime of Uzbekistan, now a great favorite, but it happens to be not very different from the Taliban, the way to do it would not be to bomb Uzbekistan, but to support internal democratic forces and let them do it. And that generalizes around the world.
Now, Robert Kaplan, who writes about foreign policy, I spoke to him recently about his book, Warrior Politics, and I put some of your points to him. He said about the distinction between the terrorist states you call Israel, America, and the terrorist states that America calls the Taliban. He said, I wish Noam Chomsky had been with me in Romania in the 70s or the 80s, just one of the 7 or 8 Warsaw states with just one of the 7 or 8 prison systems with 700,000 political prisoners. Adult choice of foreign policy is made on distinctions. The argument that Chomsky makes has no distinctions because there's a difference between the quantity and the kind of dictators that America supported and the quantity and the kind of things we went in communist world for 44 years.
Okay, so let's take his example, Romania, Ceausescu, hideous regime, which he forgot to tell you the United States supported. Supported right till the end, as did Britain. So the example that he gave is a perfect example, and it's a small example, because we support much more brutal regimes. Suharto was one of the worst killers and torturers of the late 20th century. The United States and Britain supported him throughout. He's our kind of guy, as the Clinton administration said in 1995. Horrible atrocities. In fact, when he came into office in 1965 with a coup, the CIA compared it to Hitler, Stalin, and Mao. It led to total euphoria in the United States and Britain, massive support. When he carried out even worse comparable atrocities elsewhere, the couple of, hundreds of thousands of people killed then, hundreds of thousands later, full support, continued right through the end of his rule. In fact, continued past his rule. In late 1999, when they were rampaging and destroying what was left of East Timor, the U.S. and Britain continued to support him. And I can continue through the world like this.
Well, Kaplan says that there is a distinction. That everyone's got some blood on their hands, but he says, we have significantly less blood because what we are is a soft imperialist, not state terrorist.
So like when we supported his example, Ceausescu in Romania right to the end, that's good. How about killing several million people in Vietnam? How about killing hundreds of thousands of people in Central America in the 80s, leaving 4 countries devastated maybe beyond recovery?
Does it qualify the U.S. when they're intervening in any other way?
Look, nor does it disqualify the fact that bin Laden is a terrorist, or that, say, the Taliban are a terrorist state, that fact doesn't disqualify them from bombing Washington. What disqualifies from doing that is even if they were Mahatma Gandhi, they shouldn't do it. Kaplans can't understand trivialities. The triviality here is that nobody except the ultra-right-wing jingoists like Kaplan is comparing atrocities by various countries. What honest people are saying, this seems to be incomprehensible, is that we should keep to the elementary moral level of the Gospels. We should pay attention to our own crimes and stop committing them. This would be true even if we were killing one person, okay? And it's even more true when we're killing millions of people.
Let's bring it to the bigger picture then, just because the question, he says, we all agree with the Gospels. And then
He doesn't.
But he says,
certainly does.
I believe in a Hobbesian world. This is what he says.
So is he saying we should overthrow
It's nasty. If you leave people alone, they'll kill each other.
Yeah.
And that's why what you need, was he calls, is an organizing hegemon, an overweening power.
Which is always us.
Yeah, which is always us, he says.
Right, because and why is it us? Because we have the power. And we have a massively subservient intellectual class, of which he's an illustration, which will support U.S. atrocities no matter how awful they are.
But he says this is real politics. That Chomsky's off in another land with his gospel, that he says,
forget gospel. I'm talking about the most elementary morality. If a person doesn't understand that, they have no right to talk. Okay? If you don't understand that you pay attention to your own crimes, you have no right to talk.
He talks about Machiavellian virtue. Sometimes we do a bad thing to protect our democratic and our good institutions and a just society.
Yes. Now, how are we protecting our democratic institutions by supporting mass slaughter in southeastern Turkey in the last few years? Was that supporting our democratic institutions?
Was it supporting
our democratic institutions?
Not ours, but
anybody.
Would Kaplan argue that the nation state has a right to use any means necessary to protect its sovereignty?
Oh, then he's justifying Milosevic. He's saying Milosevic had the right to do anything he wanted to repress the Kosovars in Albania. Is that what he's saying?
Do we need a constabulary, a force, a central force? In this case, it's America because it's the superpower, to sometimes use unjust means in the service of just causes.
What are the just causes? What was the just cause in, for example, slaughtering Kurds in southeastern Turkey? What was the just cause? What was the just cause in supporting Suharto when he killed a couple 100,000 landless peasants in Indonesia, went on to become one of the biggest torturers in the world, and then slaughtered a third of the population of East Timor? What was the just cause? What was the just cause when we invaded South Vietnam 40 years ago? This is the 40th anniversary of the public announcement of the U.S. attack on South Vietnam, ending up killing millions of people, leaving the country devastated. They're still dying from chemical warfare. What was the just cause? What was the just cause when we fought a war to a large extent against the Catholic Church in Central America in the 1980s, killing hundreds of thousands of people, every imaginable kind of torture and devastation? What was the just cause? Can I continue? Yeah, the just cause for people like Kaplan is we did it. Therefore, it's a just cause. You can read that in the Nazi archives, too.
Hitchens says we've seen the enemy, and the enemy isn't us. It's the Islamic fascists. Compares them to fascists.
They're an enemy.
We don't want to live with them. We don't want to negotiate them. We must destroy them. Ergo, the war against the Taliban justified. The war against the Al-Aqsa brigades justified. I mean, he has a different distinction, but we see the face of the enemy, and we should do anything to root them out. How do you respond to that argument?
I respond to that by saying that there are many evil forces in the world. If we want to stop atrocities, I think it's a great idea to reduce the level of atrocities and violence around the world. The easiest way to do it, simplest, is to stop participating in it. If we stop participating in it, we will already reduce the level of atrocities and violence enormously. And if we can ever reach the moral level, minimal moral level, of terminating our own massive participation in atrocities, then we can move to another question of what we do about the atrocities of others. And I think that it's right to deal with them. Yes, there is an enemy. There are people who carried out crimes against humanity, and there are ways to deal with crimes, not by bombing another country and putting millions of people at the risk of starvation. That's not a way to deal with crimes. When the U.S. was condemned for international terrorism in Nicaragua, and then vetoed a security, and dismissed the condemnation by the World Court, of course, and escalated the crimes, and vetoed a Security Council resolution calling on it to observe international law. The right reaction for Nicaragua was not to say, we have seen the enemy and we must destroy them, so therefore let's set off bombs in Washington. But if it's wrong for them, it's wrong for us. Again, by elementary moral standards.
We have to be careful about the term American exceptionalism. And for one thing, it's not at all exceptional. Every imperial power has behaved the same way, sometimes worse. So it's just normal imperial practice. It's called exceptionalism, but nothing about that. Of course, it's supposed to be exceptional in that we have the highest ideals. So maybe we make mistakes, but it's always with the highest ideals. That's American exceptionalism. Except that, too, is true of just about every imperial power. So when the British were destroying the world, they were always doing it with the absolutely highest ideals. The leading figures, leading intellectuals, people like John Stuart Mill, estimable people, were describing England as an angelic country beyond anything that anyone's ever imagined. People can't understand how marvelous we are, and so on. The French were the same. It's hard to find an exception. So there's no exceptionalism.
Everyone has to line up and sing hosannas to our leaders. That's the job of intellectuals. Round up the chorus so they all sing praises to your leaders while they march in the parade and tell you how magnificent we are. I mean, that's the historic task of intellectuals, not just here. I mean, it's a historic task. I mean, let's go back, say, to World War I, far enough away so we can think about it. What did intellectuals do during World War I?
Well, first thing that happened is 93 leading German intellectuals published a manifesto calling on their colleagues in the rest of the world to support Germany in its magnificent aim to bring justice and peace to the world. What did the American intellectuals do? Exactly the same thing. In fact, they all lauded the magnificence of their own leaders. There were some exceptions. Most of them ended up in jail on both sides. So in Germany, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht objected and were in jail. In England, Bertrand Russell objected. He was in jail. In the United States, Eugene Debs is the leading figure in U.S. labor in the 20th century and a socialist presidential candidate. He went to jail for raising mild questions about Woodrow Wilson's war. And others were just repressed, like Randolph Bourne was kicked out of all of his journals and so on, because they didn't join the parade. And intellectuals are supposed to join the parade, and they do. Exceptions are so rare, you can practically list them. I mean, there are exceptions, and there are honorable ones. Actually, most of them are in the third world. I'll give you quite a few. But in the West, most intellectuals are very loyal and submissive. And what you're hearing is not, don't talk about motivations, because they're very selective. As I say, Wall Street Journal is okay, Current History is okay, the Yale University volume on Age of Terror is okay. It's critics who are not allowed to raise motivations because critics are not allowed to exist. Okay, so therefore they're not allowed to do what other people do, or in fact do anything. They have to join the parade. We've passed the point where you throw them into jail in the West, but you try to get rid of them in other ways, by vilification, by lies, by defamation, the various techniques that intellectuals know very well. It's part of their métier. So that's what you're hearing. Why is there hatred against us there? George Bush's famous question. Well, everyone knows the answer to this. A couple of days after I have to distinguish two things here. There's a category of people called intellectuals. Their task is to make up fabrications that protect power and divert attention from what's obvious and indoctrinate people and so on. And they've concocted all sorts of complicated stories about globalization and, failure to enter the modern world and this, that, and the other thing. Okay, and they envy us because we're so wonderful, et cetera, et cetera. All right, we can put all that aside. That's standard propaganda. Let's talk about what is plainly the case. And is in fact discussed by serious people, like say the Wall Street Journal. So a few days after the September 11th, the Wall Street Journal, to its credit, began running serious stories in which they investigated opinions of people in the Islamic world who they're interested in, what they called moneyed Muslims, the ones with the rich ones, the important ones. So bankers, international lawyers, directors of multinational corporations, people who are right inside the U.S. system, who certainly have no opposition to what's called globalization. In fact, they're part of it, who certainly hate bin Laden because he's trying to kill them, but who nevertheless agree with much of what he says. And what they say is, their opinions are that the United States supports brutal and corrupt regimes which block democracy and modernization and development. They oppose particular policies like the decisive U.S. support for the 35-year military occupation of Palestinian territory, which has been harsh and brutal and relies crucially on U.S. military and diplomatic support. When you read in the newspapers that Israeli helicopters and jets are attacking Palestinians, that's total fabrication. U.S. jets and U.S. helicopters, which happen to be piloted by Israeli pilots, are attacking those concentrations. That's what ought to be said. Israel doesn't manufacture helicopters or F-16s, and they understand all that.
They know that the U.S. has been blocking any diplomatic settlement for 30 years, since Sadat offered one in 1971. It's not reported here, and in the West it's not talked about much, but they know it. And they know what's going on there. They also know perfectly well that the U.S. and Britain are carrying out operations against Iraq, which are devastating the civilian society and strengthening Saddam Hussein. And they also remember, as Westerners like to forget, that the U.S. has no, and Britain and France and Holland and so on, have no objection to Saddam Hussein's crimes. We know that for sure, because they supported Saddam Hussein right through the period of his worst crimes. You know, gassing the Kurds, Anfal, chemical weapons. They continued to support him very happily. He remained a good, favored friend and ally of the West, which helped provide him with the means for developing weapons of mass destruction when he was really dangerous. So they listened when Tony Blair and Madeleine Albright condemned Saddam because, you know, the ultimate monster even gassed his own people. They listen, but they add the words that are excluded in the West. They say, yeah, he committed those crimes with your support. Okay, rather crucial omission, which you never hear from Tony Blair and the rest. But they are not that indoctrinated, so they remember that those elementary truths. And those are other reasons why, if you want, there's hatred against us. Furthermore, there's absolutely nothing new about this. Anybody who wants to understand any of it knows exactly where to go. You go to the declassified U.S. record. U.S. is a very open society. We have declassified records of internal deliberations from the past. All these questions came up decades ago. So and had the same answers. In 1958, crucial year for many reasons. I'm now talking about internal records. The U.S., so the Eisenhower administration, discussed three major crises for the United States. One was Indonesia, one was North Africa, third was the Middle East. All Islamic countries, all oil producers. The question arose whether the Russians were involved. That was dismissed as ludicrous, no Russian involvement. It's just independent nationalism in the three countries, which was the main crisis. Then Eisenhower pointed out, with regard to the Middle East, in his words approximately, he said there is a campaign of hatred against us, not by the governments, but by the people. And that was an issue that was discussed. No globalization, you know, no, they hate us because we have McDonald's and none of this stuff. Why is there a campaign of hatred against us? Well, the National Security Council discussed it. That's the highest analysis and planning body. And they said the problem is that there's a perception among the people of the region that the United States supports corrupt and harsh regimes which prevent democratization and development, and does so because of its interest in controlling Near East oil. And they said it's hard to counter this perception because it's true. And furthermore, it should be true because we should support those regimes in order to maintain our control over Near East oil. So therefore, there is a campaign of hatred against us by the people who see that we're robbing their resources and preventing democracy and development. But, you know, we can't do much about it because that's what we ought to be doing. Well, you know, like I say, no McDonald's, no envying us our magnificence, no globalization, just perfectly obvious things. You know, same reason why there was a campaign of hatred against England from the people of India, or against Holland from the people of the East Indies, and so on and so forth. Yeah, you crush people under your boot, they don't like it. So there's a campaign of hatred against you. In fact, what they were discussing internally in 1958 is the same as what the Wall Street Journal found in 2001, you know, and for the same reasons, because the policies haven't fundamentally changed. So we understand. I mean, the Wall Street Journal only was concerned with elite opinion. If they'd gone down to the slums of Cairo, they would have gotten stronger opinions, but of the same kind, and more different ones also. Because in the slums of Cairo, they wouldn't like the fact that the wealth of the region is going to the West and not to the people of the region. The ones who the Wall Street Journal was talking about are quite happy about that. because they're part of the ruling elite, and they enrich themselves while the resources go to the West. So they're part of the imperial system. So you get different opinions if you bother to ask people in the so-called streets. But fundamentally, it's the same. So there's a so bin Laden's messages certainly resonate, and people agree with a lot of the things he's saying. About 80% of Egyptians, for example, say that the most important issue to them is the crushing of the Palestinians. So when they hear bin Laden say it, they agree. It has nothing to do with whether they like him or hate him. On the other hand, there is a clique of radical Islamists who were organized and trained and brought together by Western intelligence for their own purposes, and have continued to do for 20 years just what they've always said they were going to do. So while some things are obscure, I don't think these are obscure. I think the answers are quite transparent.